The klaxon screamed through the darkness like a dying animal. Varatosh opened her eyes to the same rusted metal ceiling she had seen every morning of her 19 years. The sound meant she had 11 minutes to reach her station. If she was late, the Arbites would mark her name. 3 marks meant servitor conversion. She had 2 marks already. She rolled out of her sleeping alcove, a space barely wide enough for her thin body. Around her, 10,000 identical alcoves stretched upward into the shadows, stacked 40 levels high like a wall of coffins. People moved in the dim light, all of them heading the same direction, all of them silent. Speaking before shift was against regulations. Vara pulled on her work clothes. They were stiff with old sweat and chemical residue. She had owned them for 3 years. Before that, they had belonged to someone else, someone who had died or disappeared or been taken away. She did not know which. She did not ask questions. Questions led to marks. The corridor outside her hab block was already full of workers. They shuffled forward in a gray mass, their faces empty, their eyes fixed on the floor. Vara joined them and let the current carry her toward the manufactorum. The air tasted like metal and burning oil. It always tasted like that. She had never breathed anything else. She had never seen the sky. She had heard stories about it from older workers, tales passed down through generations. They said there was a light above the hive, a great burning ball that moved across an open space. They said the space had no ceiling, that it went up forever. Vara did not believe these stories. They sounded like madness. The manufactorum floor opened before her, a vast cathedral of machines and noise. 10,000 workers stood at 10,000 stations, their hands moving in patterns they had learned as children. The machines never stopped. They ran day and night, producing loss packs for weapons Vara would never hold, for soldiers she would never meet, for wars on worlds she could not name. She took her place at her station and picked up her loss cutter. The metal was warm from the worker who had used it during the previous shift. Within seconds, her hands began their familiar dance, cutting and shaping and assembling. She did not need to think about the movements. Her body knew them better than it knew anything else. The hours passed in a blur of noise and heat. Vara did not count them. Counting made the time feel longer. She focused on her hands, on the pieces moving through them, on the simple goal of making it to the end of the shift without a mistake. Mistakes meant marks. Marks meant death. Somewhere to her left, a man named Dren was working. She had known him for 5 years. They had never spoken more than a few words, but she recognized his face, his movements, the particular way he held his tools. He was older than her, maybe 40, with gray in his hair and deep lines around his eyes. He coughed constantly, a wet sound that spoke of lungs full of chemical dust. At the 14th hour, Dren stopped coughing. Vara glanced over and saw him standing still at his station, his tools hanging loose in his hands. His face was pale. His eyes were empty. Then he fell, his body hitting the floor with a sound that was swallowed by the noise of the machines. No one stopped working. No one looked. Vara kept her eyes on her own hands, but she watched from the corner of her vision as 2 servitors came to collect the body. They were machines made from flesh, things that had once been human before the Mechanicum had rebuilt them. Their movements were jerky and wrong. Their faces showed nothing because they had no faces left to show. They dragged Dren toward the rendering vats at the back of the manufactorum. His body would be processed into protein paste and fed to the other workers. Vara had eaten that paste this morning. She would eat it again tonight. She tried not to think about what it contained. Thinking led to madness. The overseer appeared on the platform above the floor. He was a large man, or he had been once. Now most of his body was metal, crude bionics bolted to flesh that had stopped being fully human decades ago. One of his eyes was a red lens that swept across the workers like a searchlight. His voice boomed through speakers mounted on the walls. Productivity had fallen 3% below acceptable levels. This was not acceptable. The Imperium demanded more. The Emperor demanded more. Someone would be chosen for servitor conversion as an example to the others. Vara felt her hands tremble. She gripped her tools tighter and forced herself to work faster. Around her, everyone did the same. The noise of the machines grew louder as the pace increased. Someone would be taken. It would not be her. It could not be her. The shift finally ended 18 hours after it began. Vara walked back to her hab block on legs that felt like they might collapse at any moment. Her hands were shaking. Her vision was blurred from staring at the same small pieces for so long. She wanted nothing except to sleep. She collected her food ration from the dispensary, a cube of gray paste wrapped in paper. She climbed the ladder to her alcove and crawled inside. The space was dark and close, but it was hers. For a few hours, until the next klaxon, she could pretend she was somewhere else. She unwrapped her food and prepared to eat it without tasting it. Then she stopped. There was something inside the wrapper, hidden beneath the paste. A piece of paper, folded small, covered in words written by hand. Vara's heart began to pound. Written materials were forbidden. Possessing them meant death. She should throw it away, pretend she never saw it, report it to the Arbites and hope they believed she had found it by accident, but her eyes had already found the first words, and she could not stop reading. The Emperor has abandoned us. There is another way. She heard boots in the corridor below. Heavy boots, moving with purpose. She looked down through the gap in her alcove and saw them, 3 Arbites in black armor, their faces hidden behind helmets. The Overseer was with them, and his red eye was pointing upward, pointing directly at her. Vara shoved the paper into her mouth and swallowed it whole. Then she began to run. Sister Dialogus Mira Vex dipped her quill into the ink and continued writing. The words flowed from her hand in perfect script, each letter exactly the size it should be, each line exactly the distance from the last. She had been writing these same words for 40 years. She could do it in her sleep. Sometimes she did. The scriptorium was silent except for the scratch of quills on parchment. 50 scribes sat at 50 desks, copying the same sermon that had been copied 10,000 times before. The parchment was made from human skin, tanned and stretched and prepared according to rituals as old as the Imperium itself. The ink was mixed with blood donated by the faithful. Everything in the service of the God Emperor was made from human sacrifice. Mira did not believe in the Emperor. She had stopped believing 20 years ago, on the day she watched 3 of her fellow scribes burned alive for questioning a single word in the sacred texts. They had asked why the word blessing was spelled one way in some texts and another way in others. They had not been doubting the Emperor. They had been seeking truth. The ecclesiarchy had given them fire instead. She kept writing. She kept her face empty and her thoughts hidden. She had learned to live inside her own head, to build walls around the parts of herself that doubted. On the outside, she was a perfect servant of the faith. On the inside, she was hollow. The door to the scriptorium opened. A junior priest entered and whispered something to the master of quills. The master's face changed, showing an expression Mira had never seen before. Fear. The master spoke her name. Sister Mira Vex was to report to the archdeacon immediately. She was to bring her writing tools. She was to tell no one where she was going. Mira walked through corridors of polished stone and gold, past statues of saints with eyes that seemed to follow her. The ecclesiarchal district was beautiful in a terrible way, all of its beauty built on the suffering of billions. The gold that covered the walls had been mined by slaves. The incense that filled the air was made from the rendered fat of martyrs. Everything here was death dressed up as devotion. The archdeacon received her in his private chamber. He was an old man, thin and pale, with eyes that had seen too much. He told her that reports had come from the underhive, reports of heresy among the working population. A cult had formed, a gathering of unbelievers who questioned the emperor's wisdom. The Fraterus militia was preparing to purge them, but first someone needed to go down and confirm the reports. Mira was to be that someone. She would descend into the lower levels, find the heretics, and write their names in a book. Then the burning would begin. She accepted the mission without expression. She gathered her tools and her robes and began the long journey downward. The lifts took her through levels of the hive she had never seen, each one darker and more desperate than the last. By the time she reached the Underhive, she had left behind everything she knew. The Underhive was a world unto itself. Millions of people lived here in absolute darkness, surviving on scraps that fell from the levels above. The air was thick with the smell of decay and desperation. The tunnels twisted and turned like the insides of some great beast. Mira walked through them with her head down and her hand on the knife hidden in her robes. She found the girl by accident. Varatosh was hiding in a collapsed section of tunnel, pressed into a gap between two fallen beams, barely breathing. She was young and thin and terrified, and when she saw Mira's robes, she tried to run. Mira caught her arm and held her still. The girl was not a heretic. She was a manufactory worker who had fled the Arbites, and she had no idea why they were chasing her. She had found a piece of paper, that was all, a few words that someone had hidden in her food. She had swallowed the paper and run, and now she was lost in the darkness with no way home. Mira should have arrested her. She should have written the girl's name in her book and left her for the militia. Instead, she helped her stand and led her deeper into the tunnels. They found Jorik Slade at a crossroads where three passages met. He was sitting against a wall with his legs stretched out in front of him, except his legs ended at the knees. Metal replacements began where flesh stopped, crude prosthetics that whirred and clicked when he moved. He had been a soldier once, he said, a guardsman who fought on worlds Mira could not pronounce. He had lost his legs to an enemy that no longer existed, in a war the Imperium said had never happened. Now he guided refugees through the Underhive, helping the lost find their way. That he knew about the cult. Everyone down here knew. But they were not heretics, he said. They were just tired people who gathered to pray and share food. They still worshipped the Emperor. They simply dared to ask why he let them suffer so much. Mira told him about her mission. She told him about the book in her bag and the names she was supposed to write. Jorik laughed, a bitter sound with no joy in it. If she wanted to fill her book, he said, she could write his name first. He was as guilty as any of them. He had stopped believing in the Imperium's righteousness the day they threw him away like a broken tool. He led them to the gathering place, a large chamber that had once been a water reclamation facility. Now it was a church of sorts, lit by candles made from industrial grease, decorated with icons carved from scrap metal. 100 people sat in the flickering light, their faces turned toward a man who stood on a platform at the front. The man was speaking about the Emperor. He was not denying him or cursing him. He was asking questions, gentle questions, the same questions Mira had carried in her heart for 20 years. Why does he let us suffer? Why does he not hear our prayers? Is faith still faith if it brings nothing but pain? Mira felt something crack inside her, some wall she had built long ago. She looked at the faces around her and saw herself reflected in every one of them. These were not heretics. These were people who had been broken by the system and were trying to put themselves back together. Then she saw him. In the third row, sitting with his head bowed, was a face she knew better than her own. Her younger brother, Tomas, whom she had thought dead for 20 years. He had disappeared into the factories when she was sent to the scriptorium, and she had never seen him again. The ecclesiarchy had told her he died in an accident. They had lied that he looked up and saw her. His eyes went wide. He rose from his seat and pushed through the crowd toward her, and when he reached her, he took her hands in his. "Sister," he said, using a name she had not heard in decades. "You have a choice. You can complete your report and watch us all burn. Or you can put down your book and learn what the ecclesiarchy has hidden from you since birth." Mira looked at her brother. She looked at the book in her hands, the book full of empty pages waiting for names. She thought about the scribes who had burned for asking questions, about the 40 years she had spent copying words she did not believe, about the life she had lived inside walls she had built herself. She let the book fall to the floor. She did not pick it up again. Tech Adept Row 77 no longer remembered his mother's face. The memory had been removed during his 3rd year of service to make room for plasma conduit schematics. He had other memories too once, a childhood on some distant world, a sister perhaps, a house near water. They were all gone now, deleted one by one to make space for more useful data that he did not mind. He had been taught that flesh was weak and memory was burden. The omniscia required perfection, and perfection meant becoming more machine than man. Rho, 77 had followed that path for 40 years. Most of his body was metal now. His hands were precision tools. His eyes were multispectrum sensors. His heart was a fusion reactor the size of a fist that he worked in the orbital shipyards above Necromunda, maintaining the plasma conduits of an Imperial Navy cruiser. The ship was old, almost 1,000 years, its systems held together by prayer and patchwork. Every day brought new failures, new repairs, new opportunities to serve the machine god. Today he worked alongside servitors. They were different from him, these machine men. They had not chosen augmentation. They had been criminals once, or dissidents, or simply workers who had fallen behind their quotas. The Mechanicum had taken them and rebuilt them, removing their minds and replacing them with simple programming. They followed orders. They felt nothing. They were the fate that awaited anyone who failed. Point one of the servitors malfunctioned during repairs. It was a minor glitch, a momentary hiccup in its programming, nothing to be concerned about. But in that moment, something happened that should have been impossible. The servitor stopped working. Its eyes, which had been empty since its conversion, suddenly filled with something that looked like awareness. Its mouth, which had been slack and silent, began to move. It spoke a name. A child's name. Then it screamed. The scream lasted only a second before the programming reasserted control. The servitor's eyes went empty again. Its hands resumed their work. But Rho, 77 had seen it. He had heard it. And somewhere in the small organic portion of his brain, something stirred that he had not felt in decades. Doubt. His emotion suppression implants activated immediately, flooding his system with chemicals designed to eliminate the feeling. But the suppression was not complete. A fragment remained, a tiny splinter of uncertainty lodged in his thoughts. The servitor had been a person once. It still was, somewhere deep inside, buried beneath layers of programming and metal. The Mechanicum had not erased it. They had only imprisoned it. Rho, 77 returned to his duties, but the splinter would not leave. He found himself looking at the other servitors differently, wondering who they had been, what they had loved, what names they had called out before the surgery took everything. He found himself looking at his own hands, his own augmented flesh, and wondering how much of himself remained. Far below, in the underhive, others were wondering the same thing. Jorik led Vara and Mira through tunnels that grew narrower and darker with every step. They were heading upward, he said, toward the mid-hive, where they might find passage off-world. It was a desperate hope, but it was the only one they had. The Arbites would not stop searching. The Ecclesiarchy would not forget Myra's betrayal. If they stayed in the underhive, they would die. They traveled for 3 days, resting in abandoned chambers, eating fungus that grew on the walls. Mira told them about her life in the scriptorium, about the scribes who had burned, about her brother who had survived. Vara told them about the manufactorum, about Dren who had collapsed, about the food made from the dead. Jorik told them about the wars, about the planets that had been destroyed, about the soldiers who had been thrown away when they were no longer useful. Each of them carried a piece of dangerous knowledge. Together, they were beginning to understand something larger, something the Imperium worked very hard to hide. The system was not failing. It was working exactly as designed. The suffering was not a bug. It was a feature. The Imperium did not care about its people because it did not need to care. There would always be more people, more workers, more soldiers, more bodies to feed the machine. On the 4th day, they reached a junction where maintenance tunnels connected to the primary transit systems. Here they found something unexpected. A transmission station, abandoned but still functional, its screens flickering with data from the orbital platforms above. Vara knew how to work the equipment. She had learned in the manufactorum, maintaining the communications systems that connected the factory floors. She powered up the station and began scanning frequencies, looking for anything that might help them. She found terror instead. A coded transmission from an inquisitorial ship. Orders for a planetary purge. The Inquisition was coming to Necromunda, and they intended to cleanse the entire lower hive. Millions would die to eliminate a few hundred suspected heretics. The operation would begin in 72 hours. In the shipyards above, Row 77 intercepted the same transmission. His clearance gave him access to signals most others could not read, and his processors decoded the message in microseconds. He understood immediately what it meant. He had seen purges before, on other worlds, at other times. He knew how the Inquisition worked. They did not distinguish between guilty and innocent. They simply burned everything and let the Emperor sort the ashes. He could ignore the transmission. He could continue his work and pretend he had seen nothing. His duty was to the machine god, not to the flesh that crawled on the planet below. The organic portion of his brain was small and getting smaller with each passing year. Soon it would be gone entirely, and he would feel nothing at all, but the splinter of doubt remained. The servitor's scream echoed in his memory, that single moment of humanity breaking through decades of programming. If he did nothing, millions of people would die. People who had done nothing wrong. People who were simply trying to survive in a system designed to crush them. Row 77 stood at his station and felt the weight of choice. His oath to the Mechanicum demanded obedience. His augmented logic demanded efficiency. But somewhere beneath the metal and the programming, a fragment of the man he had once been demanded something else entirely. He began to access restricted files. He searched for maps of the lower hive, for maintenance passages that might serve as escape routes, for anything that might help the condemned survive. Each search was a betrayal of everything he had sworn to uphold. Each keystroke brought him closer to death. He found a passage, an old maintenance tunnel that connected the underhive to the upper transit stations. It had been sealed for centuries, but the seals were electronic, and electronics were his domain. He could open them. He could give the people below a chance. It would cost him everything. The Mechanicum would execute him for tech heresy. His augmentations would be stripped away. His remaining organic matter would be fed to the forges. But as he prepared to transmit the access codes, Row 77 realized that he did not care. For the first time in 40 years, he was making a choice that felt human. He pressed the transmit button and watched the codes disappear into the network. Somewhere below, a sealed door opened. Somewhere below, a path appeared where none had existed before, and somewhere in what remained of his organic heart, Row 77 felt something that his emotion suppression implants could not identify. It might have been fear. It might have been hope. It might have been the first stirring of a soul he had thought long dead. He did not know what it was. But he knew it felt right. Interrogator Cassian Vor stood on the bridge of the inquisitorial vessel and watched Necromunda grow larger in the viewport. He was 28 years old, young for his position, selected because of his faith and his skill and his willingness to do what needed to be done. He believed in the Imperium. He believed in the Emperor. He believed that the darkness threatening humanity required harsh measures to combat. His master, Inquisitor Draven Koth, stood beside him. Koth was old, his face a map of scars and cybernetic repairs, his eyes carrying the weight of centuries of war against the enemies of mankind. He had taught Cassian everything: how to identify heresy, how to extract confessions, how to make the hard choices that kept the Imperium alive. He had never been wrong about anything. The briefing had been clear. A cult had formed in the underhive of Necromunda, a gathering of heretics who questioned the Emperor's wisdom. Such things could not be allowed to spread. The lower hive would be purged, the heretics eliminated, the population reduced to manageable levels. It was standard procedure. It happened on 1,000 worlds every year. Cassian had participated in purges before. He had learned to see them as necessary surgery, cutting away the diseased flesh to save the body. He had learned not to think about the individuals caught in the flames. They were heretics, or they were unfortunate, but either way their death served the greater good. The drop ship took them down through the hive's atmosphere, through layers of pollution so thick that the sun was just a memory. They landed in the mid-hive and began their descent, accompanied by Fraterus militia units armed with flammers and faith. The soldiers sang hymns as they marched, their voices echoing through the metal corridors. They were happy to serve. They did not question their orders. The purge began in the outer sectors, where the population was thinnest. Cashin watched as the militia moved through hab blocks, driving residents into the corridors, separating the old from the young, the strong from the weak. Those who could work were loaded onto transports for reassignment. Those who could not were pushed toward the incinerator zones that it was efficient. It was necessary. Cashin repeated these words to himself as he watched a mother torn from her children, as he heard the screams of an old man too slow to keep up, as he smelled the smoke rising from the first burning blocks. This was the price of survival. This was what the Emperor demanded. Then he saw the woman. She was kneeling in the street, surrounded by Arbites, her hands bound behind her back. She was old and thin, her face marked by decades of labor, her body bent from a lifetime of work. In her hands, before they bound them, she had been holding something. An icon. A carving of the Emperor, made from scraps of metal welded together by someone with no skill but plenty of devotion. The Arbites commander was reading charges. Possession of unsanctioned religious materials. Unlicensed worship. Failure to report suspected heresy. Each charge carried a death sentence. The woman did not speak. She simply looked at the icon they had taken from her, the crude metal face of the god she had spent her life serving. They shot her in the head. Her body fell, and the icon fell with it, landing in a puddle of oil and blood. One of the Arbites stepped on it as he walked past, crushing the Emperor's face beneath his boot. Cashin stood frozen. He had seen death before, countless deaths, deaths far more violent than this. But something about this moment was different. The woman had not been a heretic. She had been a believer, more faithful than most, so devoted that she had carved an image of her god from scraps of garbage. And they had killed her for it. The Inquisitor appeared at his side. Koth's face showed nothing, no anger, no satisfaction, just the empty calm of a man who had seen too much to feel anything. He told Cashin that the operation was proceeding well. The militia had already processed 3 sectors. By morning, the death count would reach 7 figures. The heretics would be eliminated along with everyone else who lived in the affected zones. Cashin found his voice. He asked about the woman, about the icon, about why she had died when her only crime was loving the Emperor too much. Koth looked at him with something that might have been disappointment. The woman had died because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That was all. Her faith was irrelevant. Her life was irrelevant. The quota was all that mattered. The purge continued. Fire spread through the lower levels, consuming everything in its path. Millions fled before it, crowding into tunnels and passages, trampling each other in their desperation to escape. The militia followed, driving them like animals, burning those who fell behind. That eye and the chaos, Cashin found himself separated from his master. He wandered through corridors filled with smoke and screaming, stepping over bodies, ducking under fallen beams. The world had become a nightmare of flame and shadow. He no longer knew where he was or where he was going. He only knew that something inside him was breaking. That he found them in a maintenance junction, 3 figures huddled in the darkness, their faces lit by the distant glow of fires. A young woman in workers' clothes. An older woman in the robes of the ecclesiarchy. A man with metal legs who held a weapon in hands that knew how to use it. Jorik raised his gun when he saw the interrogator's uniform. Vara grabbed Mira and pulled her back. They were trapped, caught between the fire behind and the Inquisition before. There was nowhere left to run, but Cashin did not raise his weapon. He stood in the junction and looked at these people, these heretics he had come to destroy, and he saw something that his training had taught him to ignore. He saw human beings. He saw fear and hope and desperation. He saw himself, in another life, in another universe where he had been born in the Underhive instead of the Schola that he told them about the passage. The one that had opened unexpectedly, the one that led upward, the one that Row 77 had unlocked from the shipyards above. He told them it was their only chance, that the purge would not stop until everything below was ash. He told them to run. Jorik asked why. Why would an interrogator help heretics escape? Why would he betray everything he had sworn to uphold? Cashin did not have an answer. He only knew that he could not watch any more people die for the crime of being poor, for the crime of being forgotten, for the crime of asking questions that had no answers. He turned away from them and walked back into the smoke, back toward his master, back toward the choice he knew he would have to make. Behind him, Vara and Mira and Jorik ran toward the passage. Above them, Row 77 watched their progress on his screens and prayed to whatever gods might still be listening. And ahead of them all, waiting at the exit with his personal guard, Inquisitor Draven Koth smiled the smile of a hunter who had finally cornered his prey. The trap had been set. Now it was time to spring it. The passage opened into a transit station on the upper levels, a vast chamber of steel and glass where cargo ships loaded goods for transport across the sector. Vara had never seen anything so clean. The floors were polished. The air was filtered. The lights were bright and steady, nothing like the flickering chemical lamps of the underhive, but there was no time to marvel. Inquisitor Koth stood at the far end of the chamber, flanked by 4 of his personal guard. Their weapons were raised, their eyes cold, their faith absolute. Behind them, a cargo hauler sat on the landing pad, its engines warming, its hold open and waiting. The Inquisitor spoke calmly. He had been monitoring Cassion's growing doubt for weeks, watching as his apprentice's faith crumbled, waiting for the moment when weakness would reveal itself. He had used that weakness as bait, letting Cassion lead the heretics exactly where Koth wanted them. The escape route was a trap. It had always been a trap. Jorik raised his weapon. It was an old lost gun, battered and worn, a relic from wars that the Imperium refused to remember. He knew he could not defeat 4 trained guards and an Inquisitor. He also knew he would not surrender. He had spent too many years running. He had run far enough. The first shot came from behind. Cassion had followed them through the passage, and now he stood in the entrance with his bolt pistol aimed at his former master. His hand was steady. His eyes were clear. The doubt that had been growing inside him had crystallized into something harder, something that looked almost like conviction. Koth turned to face his apprentice. His voice carried the weight of disappointment, the cold certainty of a man who had seen betrayal before and would see it again. He told Cassion that this was the path of heresy, that doubt led to damnation, that the only way back was through blood and fire. Cassion told him that he no longer believed in paths. He had seen too much. He had watched a woman die for the crime of faith. He had seen millions burned for the crime of poverty. The Imperium he had served was not worth serving. The Emperor he had worshipped was silent. If this was heresy, then heresy was all he had left. That he fired, the bolt pistol roared, and one of the guards fell with a crater in his chest. The others returned fire, and the chamber erupted into violence. Jorik dropped 2 more with shots from his lost gun, his old soldier's instincts returning in the heat of combat. Mira pushed Vara toward the cargo hauler, screaming at her to run, to get to the ship, to survive. Koth moved like a man possessed. His power sword hummed to life, its blade crackling with disruptive energy. He cut through a support pillar as if it were paper and advanced on Cassion with murder in his eyes. The apprentice fired again and again, but each shot was deflected by the blade. Jorik stepped between them. He had no power sword, only his worn lost gun and his metal legs and a lifetime of battles that had prepared him for this moment. He bought Cassion time with his body, taking wounds that would have killed a younger man, refusing to fall even as his blood painted the polished floor. Koth drove his sword through Jorik's chest. The old soldier looked down at the blade and smiled, a terrible smile full of teeth and defiance. With the last of his strength, he grabbed the Inquisitor's arm and held him still, held him long enough for Cassion to put a bolt round through the back of his skull. The Inquisitor fell. Jorik fell with him, their bodies tangled together on the floor. Cassion stood over them both, his pistol empty, his hands shaking, his faith shattered beyond repair. Vara screamed his name from the cargo bay. The ship's engines were cycling up. More guards would be coming. They had to leave now or die here. Cassion looked at Jorik's body, at the man who had given everything for people he barely knew, and he made his choice. They ran. Vara and Mira and Cassion, 3 survivors of a nightmare that had consumed millions. They reached the cargo bay as the ship began to lift, climbing aboard through the loading hatch, falling together into the darkness of the hold. Behind them, Necromunda burned. The purge was still continuing, would continue for days, would not stop until 11 million people had been reduced to ash and memory. Row 77 watched them from his station in the orbital shipyards. He saw the cargo hauler break atmosphere and join the queue of vessels waiting for warp translation. He knew that the Mechanicum would come for him soon, that his betrayal had been detected, that his remaining days could be counted on his mechanical fingers. He did not care. For the first time in 40 years, he had done something that mattered. He had saved lives instead of maintaining machines. He had chosen humanity over efficiency. The ship entered the warp, protected by its Geller field from the horrors that swam in the space between spaces. In the cargo hold, surrounded by crates of processed ore, the survivors sat in silence. They were wanted by the Inquisition, hunted by the Ecclesiarchy, damned by the Mechanicum. They had no home, no resources, no future they could predict, but they were alive. Against all odds, against every force that the Imperium could bring to bear, they had survived. Mira spoke first. She talked about the Emperor, about faith, about the question that had haunted her for 20 years. Why did he let them suffer? Why did he not hear their prayers? She thought she understood now. The Emperor sat upon his golden throne, fighting a war that mortals could not comprehend, and he simply did not see the billions who suffered in his name. Perhaps he could not. Perhaps that was the cruelest truth of all. The Imperium endured not because it was good or just, but because its people endured. They endured not because of faith or duty, but because they had no other choice. They were born into suffering, lived through suffering, died in suffering. It was the only world they knew. Vara took out a piece of cloth, a fragment torn from her worker's uniform. She had been carrying it since the underhive, keeping it safe through all the running and fighting. She smoothed it flat against her knee and began to write on it with a stylus she had taken from Myra's supplies. She wrote names. Dren, who had collapsed at his station. The woman who had been shot for her handmade icon. The 11 million who were burning right now, whose screams were echoing through corridors of flame. She wrote each name carefully, in simple letters that anyone could read. Cashin asked her what she was doing. Vara looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much and yet still held something that might have been hope. She told him that she was remembering. Whatever world they reached, whatever life they found, she would speak these names aloud. She would tell their stories. She would make sure that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened. The Imperium could crush rebellion. It could burn cities and kill millions. But it could not erase memory. It could not silence every voice. As long as someone remembered, the dead were never truly gone. The ship flew on through the warp, carrying its cargo of survivors toward an unknown destination. Behind them, Necromunda smoldered. Ahead of them, the galaxy stretched out in all its terrible vastness, full of war and death and suffering, but in the cargo hold, 3 people sat together and shared their stories. They were not heroes. They were not rebels. They were simply human beings who had refused to forget. In the grim darkness of the far future, that was the only victory they could claim. That it was enough.